Hello and what is up, YouTube? My name is G3Iron and welcome to today's discussion where we're going to be comparing and contrasting the first week or the opening week of the Ultimatum League and the last few weeks of it. We're going to be doing a meta snapshot, as it were, and comparing class statistics, ascendancy choices, and popular skill gems, along with some trends on the passive tree as the league wraps up. If you are new to the channel, you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you disagree, or you've got an opinion, or you'd simply like to share some feedback, you can do so down below in the comments, and I look forward to interacting with each of you as time allows. Without any further ado, let's get into today's discussion, wrapping up and looking back at Ultimatum League and its meta. From the very get-go, you may be wondering where we pull all of our stats from, where we're getting our data in order to have these sorts of discussions, and the answer is simply POE Ninja. POE Ninja pulls it from the Path of Exile, various websites and databases that actually store all of our player data that is available in lots of other places, but POE Ninja displays it in a nice, simple, clean display, and so that's where we take all of our data from in order to pull together these sorts of discussions. So you can fact check us and go and check out POE Ninja. Those numbers are of course going to look a little bit different depending on when exactly during the league you take a look at these statistics, but in general you can go fact check us at any point in time on POE Ninja to check out trends and player choices in the meta. So for Ultimatum League, we decided that we were going to take a look at comparing the Softcore League and the SSFHC leagues and see exactly what those two leagues would look like when comparing those two particular different styles of play and those two particular different challenge leagues and the various challenges and obstacles that are presented in those two forms of Path of Exile, and to see whether or not players would actually adapt or if there would be any large-scale trends differentiating the two. So really quickly running through the numbers, Marauder classes were played at 5% in SC, Duelist 9%, Rangers 16%, Shadows 11%, Witch 33%, Templar 17%, and then Ascendant representing 10% of all characters on the POE Ninja ladders at the end of the league. In Ultimatum SSFHC, you see a little bit different trends and a little bit different popularity among the class choices. You've got Marauder making up 9% of the player base, Duelist at 25%, the Ranger at 13.6%, the Shadow at 12%, the Witch at only 21%, the Templar at 11%, and then the Ascendant at 8%. So our question for today's discussion is simply, how did the meta of the league change over time? If we compare week one, which you can see in the top left-hand corner of your screen, that's a snapshot from our video that we made at the beginning of Ultimatum League. And you can compare it to the snapshot that we've made here with less than a month to go in Ultimatum League for today's discussion. So what happens when you mash these numbers up and you compare the change over time from players choosing their league starters to players playing their league end build? So if you look at the top of your particular screen at the moment, you will see all of our characters displayed here, and this is the comparative chart. So we took week one and we took the end of the league and we compared, and we simply wanted to see, hey, what's the change in player popularity of character selection? So if you look at the Marauder in Softcore, you can see it's actually down in its popularity, but not by much, by less than a full percentage in terms of its popularity from week one to the end of the league. The Duelist is down 1%. The Ranger is up 4% in popularity. The Shadow is down 7% in popularity. The Witch has no movement that's notable whatsoever. The Templar is up 2%, and the Scion is up 2%. In SSFHC, it's a little bit more widely varied, where you've got the Marauder with 0 change, that's noticeable. The Duelist, that's plus 1% change in popularity. The Ranger, again, picking up some popularity at 4.3%. The Shadow losing popularity, but only minimally at minus 1%. The Witch gaining 2%. The Templar gaining 2%. And the Ascendant gaining 7%. Now again, this is just comparing the player popularity. In other words, the player movement, the number of players and the number of characters that are represented on the ladder that are playing these particular classes. Now there's all sorts of reasons why it could be that certain players play certain classes during the first week, then during later on in a league. One, of course, is availability of currency and availability of items. And it's actually pretty interesting to see how there are some trends that you see emerging in the SC League versus in the SSF HC League. For instance, Marauder seems to be pretty steady throughout. Players who play Marauder seemingly play Marauder, whether or not it's the first week or the end of the league. The same is true with Duelist. Duelist is relatively safe in terms of its overall play to either league start or to league finish. But there are some other classes that maybe trend more towards at least being perceived as league start friendly rather than league wrap up friendly, such as the Shadow, which tanked when it came to SC League, and the Ranger classes, which seem to pick up some considerable steam in terms of its popularity moving on into the end game portion of the league for Ultimatum. All right, so enough about general classes, and let's get into the specifics of Ascendancies. So in Ultimatum, at the end of the league in SC, these are your top 5 Ascendancies. The Elementalist at 14% of the ladder, the Necro at 12%, the Ascendant at 10%, the Hierophant at 9%, and the Raider and Assassin both tied at 8% for that 5th slot. On the bottom row, you've got the Ultimatum SSF HC League, and you can see the top 5 rounded out by first Champion at 13%, then Raider at 12%, then Gladiator at 10%, then Trickster at 9%, and then Ascendant and Elementalist are both tied at 8% in the 5th slot. It's interesting to note that as we compare Ascendancy choices between these two leagues, there are no particular Ascendancies that remain in the same popularity slot across both leagues. In other words, based on your league, players are making different choices for their Ascendancy. Oftentimes when we look at this inside the same league, there will be several different Ascendancies that simply have no movement in their change of place relative to their popularity. But when you begin messing with whether the league is a trade league or not, or it's a private league or not, then you start to gather lots more information about how players are deciding which Ascendancies are more powerful for the particular challenge that they are taking on. All right, here's a brief recap of the Ascendancy classes from Week 1. Week 1, we started out with the Elementalist, the Assassin, the Necro, the Occultist, and the Ascendant all coming in as relatively popular early on in SC Ultimatum. In SSFHC, you had the Ascendant coming in very early at the top spot, then Champion, Gladiator, Trickster, and Raider rounding out your top 5. Okay, so what happens when we compare Week 1 to end of the league of Ultimatum and the Ascendancy choices that players are making? You get some very interesting trends. That's the answer. So one interesting trend is that no matter what, in SC, whether it's for league starting or for league wrapping up, and you've got all of your currency and you just want to blow it on a big time character, or you want to push a character to as far as they can go, Elementalist seems to be the answer consistently throughout the Ultimatum League. Elementalist just seems to dominate this particular league and this particular meta in Path of Exile. Coming in at the rest of the couple of spots are the Assassin, the Necro, the Occultist, and the Ascendant in Week 1, and then the Necro, Ascendant, Hierophant, and Raider coming in at the end of the league, with the Occultist as well as the Assassin dropping out of those top 5 spots. One other kind of side note, interesting tidbit, is that the Inquisitor is just kind of the same popularity no matter what. I don't know if that means that Inquisitor players just play in Week 1 and like really push for high level and then they're just done playing and so they stay at the top of the ladder. Or maybe players are still playing Inquisitor. Like it just so happens to be that Inquisitor is to the middle power level or the middle power perception of the player base. They are the equivalent of what the Elementalist is to being OP and considered, the meta sheep that everybody will follow. I don't know what to make of that. It's just an interesting note that Inquisitor is right there smack dab in the middle. Something that shouldn't shock anybody when taking a look at this is that some particular Ascendancies are well known for being early boss game killers. And that, of course, is going to be, at least for today's example, the Saboteur. The Saboteur is well known and well considered to be an Ascendancy that is early game oriented or early league oriented, in that you can play it, you can take down a whole bunch of map bosses on relatively trash gear simply using the mechanics of the Ascendancy rather than depending on gear, and then you can transition out of that as you acquire more and more gear and more currency, and that trend shows that both for the Saboteur as well as for the Trickster, this particular league, and a few others of note, the Berserker and the Champion, but the Saboteur is the big one here to take note of. A lot of players play Saboteur in order to league start, and then they will swap Ascendancies later on once they gather enough currency to swap over to, let's say, something that's more popular, either the Trickster or the Assassin, depending on what meta it is and what sort of buffs there are for each particular Ascendancy. In solo self-found HC, an interesting trend emerged, which was basically players pretty much play the same thing, and there's not much movement across the board. The biggest movement across the board is going from the Ascendants. The Ascendant makes the most sense in terms of this big leap and this big change, simply because when you're playing SSF, you've got to store up a lot of currency, you've got to store up a lot of items in order to make playing an Ascendant really worth it. And so it makes sense why a lot of players wouldn't necessarily league start as Ascendant, but more and more players, as they play the game, would then choose to play Ascendant as the league progresses, as currency progresses, as items progress. But it's also an HC league, so it could just be that Ascendants are just generally the best character, and maybe other players, as they're pushing ladder, simply die off, and Ascendants are the best last man standing. That's also a scenario that's possible when it comes to talking about any HC league. For instance, I think that's my guess going on with the Raider losing 4% of its popularity. A lot of people seem to league start Raider and really push hard early on with Raider, but then Raider dropped off. It lost 4% of its popularity as the league went on. So I would say a lot of those players switched off from Raider and maybe went over and started playing Ascendants. But maybe those gains are found from other Ascendancies. The last thing to note here on SSF-HC is that some players just like to play certain Ascendancies in HC leagues and in SSF HC leagues. You'll notice just how many of these particular Ascendancy classes are the same across the board when it comes to SSF HC. I mean, the entire chart was absolute utter chaos when we were looking at Trade League SC, but when you go to SSF HC, it's pretty consistent. Players, in terms of popularity for Ascendancies and character choices, are pretty consistent across the board. Yes, there's variation here and there, but it's nothing compared to the variation and the chaos and the change inside players' heads and players' perspectives of Ascendancy power levels when it comes to Trade League and SC. All right, enough with the character classes and Ascendancies. Let's talk skill gems. Skill gems are always fascinating to take a look at because it not only shows us one aspect of players' choices regarding the meta, but it also shows us a little bit of flavor or a little bit of flair or a little bit of the aesthetic of a league. While an Ascendancy sometimes has an aesthetic side to it or a play style side to it, skill gems themselves are much more heavily weighed towards that. For instance, you can see in Ultimatum SC, Cyclone was incredibly popular towards the end of the league, with 16% of the player base using Cyclone on a 5-link. Ray Spectre, incredibly popular, with 7% of the league choosing to use it. Ball Lightning, very popular, with 6% of the league choosing to use it. When you compare those particular skills, like the top several skills that are in Ultimatum, and you compare them to Ultimatum SSF HC, you can see that the same skills aren't even on the list with each other. Cyclone doesn't even show up until 3% on Ultimatum SSF HC, and then Ray Spectre and Ball Lightning are nowhere to be found in the top several choices for players. So it's very interesting to see the flair, the aesthetic, and the playstyle. What skills are deemed to be better for the different challenges that players are taking on. At least from a player perception side of things, Cyclone is a much more softcore friendly skill than, let's say, Blade Blast or Exsanguinate. At least that's what the numbers tell us. I'm not saying, please, oh, Iron, I just heard you say that Cyclone's better than these other skills. No, that's not what I said. What I said is player perception is that some of these skills are safer to play in SC leagues than they are in HC leagues. All I'm talking about is player perception, which is the numbers. It's what all of us are thinking, not necessarily all of us actually believe about the skills themselves, but it's what we're thinking when it comes to actually making choices between these two leagues, whether we're playing Trade SC or whether we're playing SSF HC. So, what actually changed about skill gems throughout Ultimatum League? Well, in SC Week 1, this is what we're going to talk about. We're not going to focus on the SSF HC development of skills because, frankly, there wasn't much change at all, so it's not worth chatting about. I guess it's worth mentioning, hey, there wasn't much change at all. It was basically consistent across the league snapshots. But when it comes to SC, take a look at all of these changes. Blade Blast during Week 1 was the top spot for Ultimatum SC players playing on 5 links. Then by the end of the league, it dropped 6%. Only 4% of the league was using Blade Blast. Cyclone started the league in the second spot at 9% popularity. By the end of the league, it's in the top spot at 16% popularity. Ray Spectre started the league on 4% popularity, ended the league on 7% popularity. That was very interesting to me. I typically think of Ray Spectre and Necro builds and Summoner builds in general as being more league starter friendly, as something not necessarily that's fast in or progress the Atlas, but it's something that's relatively safe. But the safety of it doesn't necessarily equate to the power of it once you actually start pumping currency into it. So it's interesting to see how Ray Spectre as a summoner-based build can really be pushed towards the end game, and player perception was, as you gathered currency, to keep playing that Ray Spectre later and later on into the league. Ice Nova, the same thing could be said as well, where Ice Nova started out with 4% popularity week 1, and by the end of the league, 6% popularity. It saw an uptick in the trend. When we look at the end of the league, though, there are several skills that didn't even show up during the week 1 league starter options meta. So Ball Lightning, Summon Carrying Golem, and Stormbrand, none of those showed up as being popular skills during the early portions of the Ultimatum meta. Now, there's some other skills that did show up during the early cycle of Ultimatum that didn't last later on in the league. For instance, Burning Arrow, as well as Vortex and Toxic Rain. Those all didn't show up later on in the league as popular selections for skill gems moving forward into the late game portion of the Ultimatum League, doing big damage while you're farming whatever you want to farm at the end of a league. Again, this underlines, I think, here's, careful, take incoming. This underlines, I think, not so much the reality that some skills are better than other skills, but that some skills are better with less gear than other skills, right? There is at least that player's perception. Whether or not that's true or not, we can debate that another day. But I think it's at least worthy to note. Players very clearly that play Path of Exile at a high level, that are pushing characters to high levels of experience, they have an understanding of the game or a belief or a perspective that certain skills are better early in a league and certain skills are better later in a league. For most of you, that's not going to be revolutionary. That's stuff that we talk about here on the channel and in the community relatively frequently. But if you're relatively new to Path of Exile, that might be something for you to consider. I know in my first several builds, I didn't think that I would be playing one particular skill and then transitioning to another skill as I accrued currency and as I accrued gear. I simply thought, well, this character is going to do this, and this character is completely independent from anything else that I do. That was a really big eye-opener for me when I started to play the game more about acquiring currency and building essentially my own economy of what I could put into a character, rather than thinking of each character as being individually pre-packaged or individually made unto themselves, self-contained. On to the popular passive nodes. So I always like to take a look at these simply because looking at the heat index data that's available to us on POE Ninja is always fascinating to see what players are choosing to do with their passives. Passives are something that are available to all of us, right? Not everybody's got the same gear. Not everybody's got the same drops. Not everybody's got the same crafting ability. Not everybody's got the same crafting luck, right? Not everybody's got the same time in game. You know what we all have when we play Path of Exile and we progress to X number of levels? We all have the same passive points. So it's really, really fun to go and take a look at and see what players choose to do with those passive points based on all of those other factors, based on their luck of currency, based on their crafting, based on their gear, based on their Ascendancy choice. And it's amazing to see these three Ascendancies are the top three Ascendancies in SE Ultimatum at the end of the league. The Elementalist, the Ascendant, and the Necromancer. 14%, 12%, and 10% of the population, respectively. In other words, that's 36% of the players ranked on the ladder that we're pulling data from to take a look at. Out of all of the players that we're looking at data on, 36% of them, their trees look basically like this. Red on the lines indicate lots of players using those particular nodes or those particular travel nodes, and then green and yellow represent less and less players actually interacting with those particular nodes. Here's my point. Here's the whole point of taking a look at all this. The top left half of the tree is amazing. Okay, the Templar tree is getting selected by all sorts of ascendancies for all sorts of different purposes, whether it's for summons, whether it's for individual elemental skills, whether it's even for conversion-based skills. The top left of the tree is simply amazing and has been incredibly popular during the Ultimatum League. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. I'm not complaining. I'm not asking for a nerf. I'm not asking for any kind of changes. I'm not even making any predictions about what GGG is going to do. I'm simply saying, hey, during Ultimatum League, top left corner of the passive tree was where it was at. Well, thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. I'd love to hear down below in the comments exactly what stood out to you about player choices during the Ultimatum League. In other words, what stood out to you about the meta? What changed? What shifted? Maybe what league starters surprised you, or maybe what league finishers surprised you that you were actually ended up seeing being played by other friends in the guilds, or maybe by yourself. What builds surprised you as you wrapped up your Ultimatum League? Thanks once again for joining us for today's discussion, and I hope that the upcoming 3.15 League Is the League a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.